In her own words, Hilary Mantel lives in a mock Tudor monstrosity on a soulless new estate on the outskirts of Woking in Surrey. The builders are still working on the finishing touches, but already she and her husband are thinking of moving, though the anonymity of the place must appeal to a writer who rejoices in facades and household routine. The more orderly you are, she once said, then the less people know about you. Concealment is very important for writers. Hilary Mantel, who is 45, was born in Derbyshire and started to write when she was living in Botswana and Saudi Arabia. At that time, her husband, Gerald, was a geologist and they moved abroad for his work. They don't have any children. Her first two novels, Every Day is Mother's Day and Vacant Possession, are located in the north of England, in 1974 and 1984 respectively, and follow the story of a woman who lives with her mother in a state of mutual disgust. Her third novel, 8 Months on Gaza Street, is a psychological thriller set in the Middle East. Flood, her fourth novel, is a comedy. Its backdrop is a fictitious moorland village in the 1950s, the principal characters being nuns and priests. For her fifth novel, however, she moved into new and very different territory. A Place of Greater Safety is an extraordinary feat of recreation. Harking back to the French Revolution, it brings to life that tumultuous time with astonishing verve and brilliance. It is not, the novelist insists controversially, an impartial account. I have tried to see the world as my people saw it, she says, and they had their own prejudices and opinions. A Place of Greater Safety deservedly won the 1992 Sunday Express Book of the Year Award. There have been two further novels, A Change of Climate, which is rooted in Norfolk, where Hilary Mantel often spends weekends watching cricket, and An Experiment in Love, which focuses on 3 young girls at university in the early 70s, a time the novelist herself views with ambivalence. Well, I was reading the introduction to A Place of Greater Safety,
yes.
Hilary, where you're talking about how do you distinguish between fact and fiction, especially in a historical novel. And what you say there is that the less likely it seems to be true, the more probably it is true. Is that the way you look upon things?
I think it's certainly true of that novel.
Yeah.
And I was aware that as I was writing it, that people are going to say this is a tissue of invention. But those are very often the bits that are true. And of course, what you're attracted to is the quirkiness in certain characters, the unpredictable things they do. I think A Place of Greater Safety is documentary fiction. And where the truth is to be had, it sticks with it. There are, of course, the spaces between the facts, where the novelist goes on operating after the historian has stopped.
Yes, because you can verify some facts, but you can't verify character, dialogue, lots and lots of detail, and then, of course, you know, the inner emotions of people as well. But
it's motive, yes, motive's what goes missing in historians' work. I think, you see, in that book, I worked as hard as I could. If I give you somebody's address, you can be sure it's their real address. A lot of the dialogue is actually taken from people's speeches and writings, because I have this theory that people try out casually and informally what they're later going to set in stone, as it were. So it has that sort of real life texture. But I think there are certain questions that you go on asking yourself as a novelist after a historian has bowed out, and maybe even after a biographer has bowed out, because you have a kind of license to speculate. But I think it's important only to speculate on a very firm foundation of research.
Yes, yes. I mean, the interesting thing is also when I was reading it, the great French novelists were going through my mind, you know. Would they have prefaced their novels at that time and said, you know, we're writing historical fiction, but here are some caveats before you delve into the book? Do you think it's a modern thing now that we've got to forewarn the readers where the boundaries are?
I think you have to, in a sense, discuss it with your reader now, simply because historical fiction has got such a bad name. It's unrespectable, and people at once equate it with historical romance. And also, I think that one has to have a consciousness that one is presenting a version, a spectacle. One American critic said, the French Revolution is a theatre, and at the moment a place of greater safety is playing at it. And I felt that very much, that the revolution was conscious of itself as a theatrical spectacle, and that one can't approach it straight. You have to take a more or less ironic perspective. The people who were living through it were conscious of the moment when they stepped onto the stage of history. I'm not writing about people who were great men from their cradles, but people who can say at an identifiable moment on such a day, I became a person who entered into history. I think this is very different from writing about kings and lords and so on, people who've been observed from their cradle. Plus, I think the greatest influence on what I've written is not a novelist, but unfashionable though it is to say, it's Brecht. And I kind of think of A Place of Greater Safety as a Brechtian novel, where almost somebody carries on a placard to say, now we will have the March of the Women to Versailles, and then it is enacted for you. But you're always conscious of a kind of collusion between reader and writer. And
a distance as well.
A distance, yes.
But events, of course, have elevated these people. And what the scenario you're describing there is almost a sort of postmodern take. The French revolutionists, postmodernly, looking at themselves as the events were happening and being aware of themselves being on the stage.
That's right. What they had was, let us say, it's rather like the life of Christ, 30 years of obscurity and 3 years of public ministry. And there's an absolute divide between the two things, and they are changing under the pressure of event very rapidly as people, as events change around them. And what I wanted to get was a sense of the almost panic that began to run through people's days. One of the revolutionaries who actually survived, Beauvain, said later that you reproach us with the means we use, but we had not one day, we had not 1 hour. In other words, one was acting always under the presence of events that were not understood, that were not graspable. And of course, with so few templates, we have a much better idea nowadays from the historical record of how people behave in revolution, and how, if you can consider revolution as an entity in itself, how revolution behaves. They had no models except in antiquity, which is a very poor guide.
And they had no hindsight at all. As you say, they were being rushed along with a swollen stream and couldn't stop. They were being carried along with the tide of events.
That's very important, and I think that is, again, the great difference between a historian and a novelist. You can, as it were, move forward. Obviously, you have hindsight, but it is less necessary to you to make an analysis than it is to the historian, because, of course, hindsight is the historian's great friend, but it also corrupts him. A novelist can try at least to make the imaginative effort to move forward with the people she's writing about. I find it strange. I was talking with a book group recently, mostly about that novel, and my head was reeling, because I realised that not only did they presume that the revolution from its foundations was wrong-headed, but also that they had no idea of the kind of... They were thinking of it as a kind of Holocaust. And as Orwell said, the Reign of Terror was a joke compared to one of Napoleon's battles. People have a very, very wrong sense of scale about it. I agree. Each individual has only one death to die, so it's not really a numbers game. But these were well-read, educated people with no information but a huge weight of prejudice about a seminal event in modern history. It's a kind of ignorance that one wouldn't, for example, tolerate about the Holocaust.
Yeah, sure. But the interesting thing also you were saying is this was a book you started writing in the 1970s, and it's a very different kind of book from your other books. I mean, it's a book that comes heavily freighted with research, for example. Was this the first book you started working on then?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
I started on the research when I was 22, a year out of university, and I couldn't imagine ever writing any other novel. I just wanted to write that novel. Nor could I imagine writing anything that wasn't sort of essentially research-based, because I think, certainly at that stage, I was a dramatiser and a synthesiser. I wasn't an imaginative writer. And it was a long while before I gave myself the latitude to make anything up, because when I began, I thought, if you researched and researched, you would get at everything in the end. Gradually it was borne upon me that this wasn't so. And also, it happened that in 1977, my husband and I went to live abroad in a place where I had no research facilities whatsoever.
Well, that's amazing, because what you're saying is you went to the Middle East, I think it was.
Well, we went to Botswana first of all.
And then to the
and
Middle
then
East.
to the Middle East.
To the Middle East. So all these props of your former writing life were taken away from you when you went there. You had no libraries, you had no research facilities, and suddenly you had to use your imagination to write a book, if you wanted to write a book. So you put the big book on the back burner, the book that you've been working on for all this time, and then started on a new kind of book. I mean, how did you actually do that? How did you go about it?
Well, I didn't actually put it on the back burner. I finished it. But then it and I had various misadventures involving sudden rheumatic illnesses and lost manuscripts and so on, which is all very tedious.
Yeah, sounds very interesting.
Well, it seemed a practical decision at one point, after we went back to Botswana for a second 2.5-year stint. I was realising how tremendously difficult it was going to be to sell this book, which was over 300,000 words long. It's the first novel. Who was going to commit to it? And I thought I had better just draw back, the better to leap, and try to write a book that would be more instantly accessible to people. But it would be the best I could do, but something that seemed at first sight to have more commercial possibilities. And so, as you say, I started on something that couldn't have been more different, a book that drew on the time I spent as a hospital social worker.
This is Every Day is Mother's Day. Yeah.
Yes, Every Day is Mother's Day. But you see, by that time I'd written 2 drafts of A Place of Greater Safety, and I'd encountered almost every problem that a novelist can encounter. So I reckon that at a technical level, at least, I could do it.
You were equipped, you'd sort of served an apprentice.
That's right, yes. And I don't ever think of all those years as wasted, because it was an apprenticeship to myself. Plus I didn't have the heartbreak of going around with manuscripts and collecting rejections.
So you never actually sent it to anyone either?
One publisher had seen it and then contrived to lose some of it. But my copy was 7,000 miles away, and I dare not send for it, etc. So that was how it came to be put in the drawer. But you see, also by this time, I had learned where the gaps were in my facts about the French Revolution, and I had learned where imaginative interpretation must come to my aid. So I'd learned to be an imaginative writer. I certainly wasn't one when I started off.
Can we go back a long way back and talk about how you became a writer? And what made you a writer? Did you make a kind of conscious decision when you were at university, say, that the writing life was for you?
No, it wasn't until I actually decided I wanted to write something about the French Revolution, and it had to be a novel because I was not equipped to write anything else. So it wasn't even something I drifted into, but took a very conscious decision on one day that I'm going to begin researching and writing this book. And what I do after that, I don't know, but it's going to take me many years. And it was very perverse of me not to go to university to study history, but in fact I read law. I'd hoped to go to the bar. Lack of funds prevented that. Found myself at a bit of a loose end. Went off to work in a geriatric hospital in the social work department. And I was trying to think my life through again. And then I seemed to hit on what I really wanted to do. So after that, I gave up any thoughts of doing a professional job.
This seems an extraordinary way to sort of delve into a writing career. You know, there's not many novelists that I can think of that start with a 300,000 word novel about the French Revolution and the scale that you've tackled it on, and to take a conscious decision like that. I mean, is there any childhood work in your background? Is there a bookishness in the family that suggests that you might have been going that way? You know, to take a decision to go this way seems fairly extraordinary and unprecedented to me, I would say.
Well, I mean, I don't come from a bookish family at all. I was really the first person in my family to have higher education. But I was encouraged to read as a child, and I was a great reader. And I suppose that books were a great deal more important to me than what was going on in real life a lot of the time, or rather, what was going on in the books did seem to be real life. And I suppose that that is a fairly typical background for a writer. But having said that, I know now that unconsciously, perhaps I was cultivating writer's habits.
What are writer's habits?
Well, I mean, for instance, every morning when I walked to school, I would do the weather inside my head, which meant that I had this great mental file of weather conditions. But what I was making myself do was skewer down exact words, not to allow half-formed impressions to wash around in my head, but to turn a paragraph that was as perfect as I could get it.
It sounds like you had a writer's gene in your blood that somehow, you know, you were never going to be able to escape from. You were going to be a writer. You know, if you were doing that at that age.
Maybe, but if I hadn't sort of coincided with the revolution, I don't quite know what I would have written about.
So where did the revolution come from then? Your interest in history?
Yes.
Because a good teacher vividly taught it.
A very good teacher who was interesting because she was not the kind of teacher who made history into pretty stories. She was interesting because you knew that what she was telling you was the tip of the iceberg. And so you sat through her classes with a sense of intrigue and wonder. You might say that she allowed the spaces between events to show, and it's in that gap that your imagination gets to operate.
We talk about then, we know where a place of greater safety came from and what that took out of your life. But if you took a book like, say, Flood, and can you tell us about how that was conceived and how you went about then writing it, just the process of it?
Yes, well, Flood came out of a conversation I had with my mother. I was in London at the time visiting her in Manchester, and I grew up, I attended the same village school in Derbyshire as my mother and my grandmother, and we began to talk about certain events that had taken place in the parish when I was a very small child, the removal of the statues from the church. And my mother said, and then also there was that strange business, but I think it was before you were born, of the priest who disappeared. And I then got on the train to go back to London, and I wrote for the 2 3/4 hours. That was the beginning of Flood. But I had only just started 8 months on Gaza Street, my novel about Saudi Arabia. So I had to put Flood aside. But what I'd heard was I picked up its intonation. I picked up its rhythm. So it didn't matter then that I didn't go back to it for 18 months, say, because once I've heard that, I've got that wavelength, it doesn't matter to me.
When you came back to Flood then, can you tell us what happened? How did you write it then? Did you write it very fast? And how do other people live with you when you're living with a novel? I mean, are you not in sort of vacant and in pensive mood most of the time?
It's more like rage than vacant and pensive, I think. You see, I don't write every day. I don't even write every month. And if people knew how little time I actually spend at my desk, they'd just be disgusted. Because this is... I love those day-in-the-life things, you know, where she goes to her desk at 9 o'clock and at 11 o'clock the butler brings in 2 chocolate biscuits, you know, on a silver tray. And she breaks off for a little light lunch at 1. And my life is absolutely nothing like this at all. I spend hours in the simple busyness of being a writer, administering oneself and going out to talk to people, do readings, sit on committees, all this kind of thing, which is wonderful distraction. I do quite a lot of journalism and then fall into this state of kind of inertia where nothing seems to be happening. And in the end, I'm so mad with myself that I have to go and write. And I'm not very good at keeping up a steady rhythm of work, and things get going about 5 o'clock in the evening. I daren't write in the morning. I'm too frightened to write in the morning. But by the end of the day, nothing done again. Desperation conquers fear. And you get down to it, and then it's as long as it takes, I think. I think there are things I'd wish. I wish I were better at having interests and hobbies, you know, a little like tatting or something.
Well, you must be interested in something other than, being frightened from morning to 5 o'clock at night and worried about, should I write and another fruitless day gone by.
Everything I get interested in tends to end up as something to do with writing or feeding back into it. Quite abruptly, about 12 years ago, I became passionately interested in cricket. So the next thing I knew, I was reviewing cricket books, writing little columns, and so on. And then after a time, I'm thinking, wouldn't it be good to write a novel about a professional cricketer in the 1930s, you know? and how does one come to grips with this? Because to a huge percentage of your readers, it's a turn-off. And could you do that? Could you manage it technically without losing your readers every time you describe a match and so on? So, everything, every interest I take up tends to start turning itself into fiction sooner or later.
Do you find it physically very tiring to write?
Yes, because I put in long stints when things are going well.
What would you call a long stint?
I call 8 hours a long stint. I don't eat or anything like that. I think when you begin a book, 2 hours is a very good day's work if you're generating new stuff. And that's not, I think, very stressful at all. But I think what happens when you're working for hours and hours, you kind of forget to move or forget to relax and your body just locks. And then you have to kind of defrost yourself at the end of this process in a hot bath or something like that. But the trouble is, when you're in the bath, you get a really good idea and you're out of the bath and you're off again. So it's pretty unrelenting. However, I have to emphasise that this is only a very small fraction of the time that I live like this. The rest of it, I appear to be like one of those sloths that live in trees and green things grow on them, you know.
Have you ever found yourself in the middle of a book, stuck and not know where to go?
Yes.
What does that feel like?
I got very, very stuck with a change of climate. And that book, it just would not resolve itself. I think usually if you've got that problem, there is some element you have not yet resolved. It's very easy to start writing with your plot, your characters, even you might say your theme, your narrative structure's in place, but still not know what the book is about. I think the difficulty with a change of climate may have been to do with the fact that the book is about the revelation of a secret, and the reader has to be given a certain amount of information, but no more. And just as I was dealing out the information with a grudging hand, so the book was dealing with me grudgingly. And it was as if it would not resolve itself onto the page. And I never had such a hard struggle as with that book. And in the end, I had to think, well, it just won't go gracefully. I will make it go. I've done it before. I will wrestle it onto the page through technique. I don't think the joins show, and I don't think the struggle shows, but when somebody mentions that book, I have an almost involuntary flinching away from it.
Can you describe the room in which you work in? Do you have a view? Do you have bookshelves there? Do you have your favourite authors? Are there any talismans in the room that make you feel comfortable about writing, that you wouldn't feel comfortable writing in that room if they weren't there?
Well, it's a bedroom with a computer in it, basically, and a photocopier and a fax machine. And the books, either things that have come in as proofs to be read or the books of current concern. It has no atmosphere, it has no particular view. I don't have any talismans. It's furnished with a photograph of Eamon de Valera, which people always think highly significant, but I can't see why. That's the only thing that hangs on the wall at present. I'm not superstitious. I have no special pens, no special paper. I could write anywhere. I do write anywhere. I don't mind if it's noisy. All hell could break out and I just carry on.